So self-compassion, which is the tendency to mindfully and unconditionally treat yourself with kindness, has been shown to reduce stress, depression, and anxiety and increase motivation, but how do we actually make ourselves more self-compassionate? Psychologists have tested a few interventions that have been shown to increase self-compassion that you can probably do on your own. One of the interventions tested was in the context of a binge eating study. Some researchers wanted to see how self-compassion influences binge eating. They wanted to do this experimentally, so they developed a short intervention to use to help promote self-compassion. And it worked. The first step of this intervention was to explain how exactly self-compassion relates to the problem of binge eating. Participants were then asked to think of a time where they received compassion from somebody they care about, or a time where they were compassionate to somebody they cared about. After that, they were asked to imagine talking to themselves from an understanding and compassionate perspective. Then they were asked to write down what they would say. And the same intervention was used in two studies, one dealing with regret and one involving motivation. And this is basically self-compassionate journaling. After you write yourself letters from a compassionate perspective, it's easier to automatically talk from a compassionate perspective. And this kind of practice is really important because even after you understand a concept like self-compassion, it can still be difficult to implement it in real life. So as you practice it, you internalize it. Although it is very important to understand the concepts behind it first. Psychologists researching self-compassion's impact on athletes' performance made sure that before their intervention, they described in detail the concept of self-compassion and a little bit of the research that's gone into it so far. And they make sure to emphasize the fact that self-compassion actually improves motivation because that's a concept that a lot of people have trouble with. That's also why I made a whole separate video specifically on self-compassion and motivation. Two other elements of self-compassion that psychologists try to implement into the interventions is the emphasis on common humanity and mindfulness. So usually, in addition to the self-compassionate journaling, participants are asked to write a paragraph about how the thing they're experiencing is also experienced by other people. And this promotes the idea of common humanity. People are also often asked to explain the situation they're in from an objective and unemotional perspective. And this can promote mindfulness. And I'll post links to resources about mindfulness because that's also a really important concept if you want to be happy in life. And if you're struggling with self-compassion, therapy is also a really good option. The concepts of self-compassion are pretty easy to integrate into almost every therapy. In cognitive behavior therapy, there's a lot of emphasis on automatic thoughts. And a lot of automatic thoughts that people with depression tend to suffer from are extremely self-critical ones. Self-compassion is a really good way to avoid those. In rational emotive behavior therapy, there's very strong emphasis on unconditional self-acceptance, which in combination with mindfulness is basically self-compassion. But overall, if you want to be more self-compassionate, try self-compassionate journaling, focus on common humanity, mindfulness, and try therapy if you really think it'll help you. That's all I have for today. I hope you learned something. Like and subscribe and support me on Patreon.